The cost of the war in Ukraine to Russia has been felt in the Middle East. I mean, it basically gave up Syria so that it could focus its attention exclusively on Ukraine. It was not able to intermediate in any positive way in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And rather than sort of serving its traditional role of sending Russian forces and acting as a buffer, it did not, because it is completely taxed in Ukraine. And so I think that this is why it's such a sensitive matter for them to see Armenia so strongly sort of align itself with the US and the EU.
This is the Global Gambit.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Global Gambit. We're going to be doing a two-part conversation today because there's quite an interesting set of developments aside from the situation across the Middle East and the renewed escalations, what seems to be the renewed threats of America or Trump taking over Kharg Island and potentially suggesting the idea of a ground offensive, although he then walked that back just a few hours later. But simultaneous to that has been a very important but also symbolic, noteworthy election in Armenia for one particular reason. Putin is quite significantly losing influence, and it's a reflection of the diminishing sphere of influence, ability of the Russian Federation to exert influence in a part of the world, its backyard, that many people never questioned it would. But joining me to take a look at both these issues in this two-parter is American human rights lawyer Leah Whitson, who is the former executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn, and was also the director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division for over 15 years. Someone who we had on the show, I think, Sarah, it was like 2 years ago at this point. We had you on the show, and it was a very timely one given that it was just after the war and the situation in Gaza had materialized. So I wanted to start off by, I think, looking at the election in Armenia, because you've just returned from there, and there's no other better experience than firsthand on the ground. So just to lay the land, so to speak, what's the what did you see, and how do you feel coming away from it?
Yeah, I was and continue to be part of the International Observatory for Democracy in Armenia that has conducted now 2 investigative missions in the country to examine the pre-election democratic conditions. And, you know, in a nutshell, what we've found is dramatically expanded repression by the government against opposition candidates, against political opponents, against journalists, you know, ordinary citizen critics, in a bid to not only maintain a majority in parliament, but in its efforts to secure supermajority. And the reason why it's so essential for the Armenian ruling party, the civil contract party, to secure that supermajority is that it will give it the power to amend the constitution, to deliver to Azerbaijan the final conditions for its peace agreement or capitulation agreement with Azerbaijan, to sort of renounce any aspirations or goals for Artsakh, the Armenian enclave, what was the Armenian enclave within Azerbaijan. The elections are still being contested. It is literally down to 70 votes, 0.04% of one of the opposition party's votes, that will determine whether or not the ruling party has that supermajority that it wants. But more broadly speaking, the election and Armenia itself has now evolved into the latest contest between Russia and the West, or specifically the United States and EU, as a new zone of influence. You know, historically, Armenia, Soviet Armenia, part of the former Soviet Empire, has been pretty aligned, I would say, with Russia, or a country that's really tried to balance its relationship with Russia and with the West, receiving a lot of military support and protection from Russia, while also receiving a lot of economic support from the EU and the United States. But with this war and with Russia's failure to come to the defense of the Armenians in Artsakh and otherwise to act as a security buffer for Armenia, that has dramatically shifted, and the prime minister and the ruling party have really shifted overall to putting themselves in the EU/US side of the ledger. The TRIP agreement, this so-called Trump agreement over the Lachin corridor, which is a route that is meant to allow Azerbaijan to connect with an enclave in Nakhichevan via Armenian territory, giving the United States something like 100-year lease over this corridor that'll be administered by US security forces, is, I think, the first time we will see this level of American physical presence in Armenia, in the South Caucasus, even military presence in Armenia, in the South Caucasus. And Pashinyan has said that he is going to leave the security framework, the Russian-controlled security framework that Armenia has been part of for a long time, with aspirations of joining the EU. And of course, the EU has dangled joining the EU as a possibility when it's completely implausible that would ever come to pass. From my perspective and my focus, what I've seen is deteriorating conditions, democratic conditions in the country that Pashinyan is able to get away with full support and backing from the US and the EU, because for the US and the EU, the only thing that matters is getting Armenia on their side, regardless of a drift towards authoritarian rule in the country.
So despite, it's more nuanced than simply saying that Pashinyan's party and victory of nearly 50%, 49.8, I think it was. The pro-Russian opposition, if you like, taken a combined 30, 32 sort of range, but that's not the full picture as you've clearly laid out. So how should we feel about this result? Happy, sad, cautious, pensive?
I mean, I have repeatedly had to explain to Armenian observers, both in the diaspora and inside Armenia, that, what's essential is that the Armenian people actually have a choice, actually have an ability to participate in fair and free elections. Personally, I don't have a view as to which party should win, whether it should be Pashinyan's party or Kocharyan's party or any other party, including Samvel Karapetyan, who's accused of being pro-Russian and has been under detention, house arrest for many, many months now. What I care about is the survival of democracy in Armenia. What I want is that the Armenian people have the ability to express their views freely, to not be charged and jailed when they get into a debate with Pashinyan, which is something that's happened, and for there to be, pluralistic, politically competitive, open sphere in which Armenians can debate what are the best policies for the country. Politically, I think Armenia has been wise and frankly has no choice but to adopt a policy that doesn't put it in anyone's camp, that maintains good relations with Iran, with Russia, with the EU, with Georgia, with Turkey, with Azerbaijan. I mean, these are just the political realities that Armenia has to contend with as a tiny little country surrounded by hostile neighbors, warring neighbors, geopolitical rivals that don't actually care about Armenia. And so its only strategy is to have good relations with all of the countries that naturally will have an influence in this tiny little country.
But many reports were saying how heavy an effort the Russians were covertly trying to undermine the incumbent, right? The disinformation campaigns, a plan to even transport Russian Armenians to Armenia to try and sway the vote. I don't know if you can confirm that, but it just sounds very similar to the efforts that they undertake in Romania, in other parts of the Eastern, Central Europe, former Soviet states. In this case, it just has also failed.
I would say that there was a massive influence campaign, Western and Eastern, Russian and European, to sway Armenian voters. And some of that influence campaign, some of that interference in Armenia's elections was very overt. You had President Trump, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, President Macron, other European leaders openly endorsing Pashinyan ahead of the elections and promising Armenians all kinds of goodies should Pashinyan win. And in fact, Pashinyan was even saying that if the opposition wins, it means a return to war. And U.S. officials were echoing that view. The EU supported the ruling party and the government with 14 million euros in countering foreign intelligence. There has been allegations that the government itself ran a misinformation campaign using AI and fake videos and so forth. There's also the allegations that Russia has done some of these things, including AI videos from celebrities that, in fact, I don't even think Armenians have heard of. We investigated the allegations of this kind of Russian interference. We reviewed some of the documents that were purported to have been leaked from Russian intelligence. We could not verify them. We could not find any evidence that Russia is behind an actual, somewhat fantastical campaign to send 100,000 Armenians who live in Russia to Armenia to vote in what is a secret ballot, secret election. We asked everyone who made these claims what their evidence was, and nobody showed us any evidence, including the election commission that was supposed to be investigating this. One civil society organization said that they had interviewed 70 Armenians in Armenia who told them that their relatives in Russia had told them that they were going to be paid to come to Armenia, all expenses paid, to vote for Samvel Garabedyan's party. Even if that's true, that certainly doesn't prove that the Russian government is behind it. It may well be that one of the opposition parties is behind it. But how that plot would be effective or come to fruition is not a question anyone has been able to answer. I don't think we've seen any evidence of tens of thousands of Armenians arriving in Armenia just to vote in this election. So I think some of these claims have been overstated or certainly lacking in evidence. Unfortunately, it seems like now in 2026, this kind of malware is part of any election, whether it comes from domestic bad guys or foreign bad guys. And it's harder and harder for any election in the world to be a genuinely domestic contest.
I think the Caucasus is an epitome of a location where so many foreign interference, be that supranational from the EU or the United States by extension, Turkey, and obviously Russia being the main ones, but even to a lesser extent the Iranians, maybe with Azerbaijan and that minority group in the northwest. But I have to be honest, I'm quite surprised that you don't think that the Russians would have more inclination to do this. It strikes me that Putin is not in a good position in Ukraine, and we've seen a loss of his ability to project power. That's why Georgia's been such a hub of political instability and flare-ups in the past couple of years with the protests and public demonstrations, but also, of course, across the broader Middle East, with Russia's inability to keep stable in Syria, so many different areas, right? So if the Russians are not doing it as much, was the EU doing it more? Is there sort of or it was too difficult to tell, it's just everybody's doing it and that's wrong for the Armenian people? Is that your bottom message? You're on mute now.
Yeah, no. Starting with the understanding that I have no doubt that Russia engages in interference in elections around the world. And frankly, so does the United States. I mean, we know it. The facts are there. And sometimes the interference in elections takes, physical, violent forms. And we've seen that as well. I'm saying specifically with regard to the allegation that Russia was plotting to send 100,000 Armenian citizens who live in Russia to travel to Armenia to vote for opposition candidates that support them in a secret ballot where they have no way of knowing whether the person they paid to fly to Armenia actually did what they wanted, is not something we saw any credible evidence of. So could it happen? Sure, it could happen. Did it happen? I don't think there is evidence, not any that we've seen, despite our 2 investigations in the country and asking everyone engaged on this matter to share what evidence they had. I think it was Reuters or AP ran an article on this, and they cited some American intelligence sources backing this claim. But, frankly, I don't see that as evidence, especially when I, for many years, documented American intelligence sources or American officials speaking anonymously, making all kinds of fantastical claims about actors in the Middle East for which, no evidence was ever presented or shown. I don't think that proves, therefore, that Russia is financing them, backing them, behind a misinformation campaign. I mean, those are things that need to be proven. Those are things for which we need to have evidence. What I am most disturbed about, or more disturbed about, is that the countries that purport to support democracy, purport to be fighting authoritarianism, are willing to turn a blind eye when we have the ruling party and the ruling government in Armenia undermining democracy, undermining democratic freedoms, arresting ordinary people because they criticize the government, charging political opponents with evidence-free charges of trying to overthrow the regime, for example, which is what the leading opposition candidate has been charged with. But not a peep of protest or criticism from the so-called pro-democracy forces of the West. What Armenia's most valuable asset, frankly, perhaps one of its only assets, is its status as a democracy in the Caucasus, is its existence as a true democracy surrounded by many, many countries, every country around it, that are not democracies or that have already slipped into authoritarianism. So that is what should be preserved and protected in Armenia. That is what I think is going to be most helpful for Armenia.
No, that's fair enough. In this administration, you've got JD Vance flying over to Hungary to sort of rally support for Viktor Orban, which is the weirdest thing. No other US sitting VP has ever done that. But I don't know. I'm not entirely sure of as egregious interferences by previous American administrations as Putin on behalf of elections. Maybe you're more privy to information than that. But what does this do then for the conditions then? Because Armenia's parliament formally endorsed EU accession in early 2025 and applied for membership. Now, you've already shot down the idea that EU membership for Armenia is a pipe dream. It's absurd to think that. So is there some kind of relationship that Armenia can have with the EU, like a sort of second or third tier relationship, which gives them greater protection from foreign interference? Like a bit sort of like people are saying that Ukraine should be given fast track membership of some form. I think what's known as the stabilization and association mechanism. Do you think these sorts of things could be possible for Armenia, or it doesn't make a difference?
No, I think it's very important for Armenia to have very strong relations with the EU, and I think they already have pretty strong relations with the EU. The EU just hosted its sort of massive global convening in Armenia, again, just ahead of the election. First time ever it's been held in Armenia. I think the first time ever it's been held in the Caucasus, as another show of support and sort of show of influence in Armenia. I think that the only strategy that's going to protect Armenia and protect its population is having good relations with all of its neighboring countries. I mean, Russia is Armenia's biggest trading partner. Russia has, tremendous ties with the country. There's a sizable Russian diaspora, particularly since the war in Ukraine, in Armenia. So Armenia can't afford to take steps that are going to alienate and piss off Russia so much that it retaliates, as it has already been doing since Armenia, since Pashinyan and Putin had a very tense exchange where things got quite spicy. And, I think Russian analysts were saying that Pashinyan was insulting to Putin and vice versa. I don't think that's good for Armenia. So it's in a very terrible position, like many small countries. Forget about middle-sized countries trying to navigate the geopolitical contests between China, Russia, the U.S., and so forth. It's just has to find a way to balance its relationships such that nobody sees it as being in one camp or.
Okay. No, I think the only reason I ask is because I think a lot of people would be pushing back or questioning that approach. But I think would it be right in saying you're just being pragmatic about it? Armenia doesn't really have a choice in this regard. Its geographical relationship to the European Union is so far away, and versus Russia, which is right next door. What about Turkey in that regard? Then we've seen some interesting shifts in just the past couple of days. Week or so with Erdogan's comments towards Putin, and the Turks and the Russians have always had a competitively cooperative, I think is the term I once read in an academic article describing their relationship. It's not been great in the past 10 years because of Syria and other matters. But where do you view Turkey in all of this?
Well, I mean, for a very long time, Turkey's policies with respect to Armenia have really been dictated by Azerbaijan. And I think that is fraying a little bit. And there were some recent sort of criticisms in the media about Azerbaijan having, in the Turkish media, about Azerbaijan having too much influence on Turkish policy with respect to Armenia. The Turkish government has announced that they are going to open the first crossing with Armenia. This will be the first opening of a border between Turkey and Armenia for, probably forever. I don't know how long, certainly the last several decades. And, of course, I welcome good relations between Turkey and Armenia, and frankly, Armenia and Azerbaijan. A state of war is much worse for Armenia than it is for Turkey and Azerbaijan, because Armenia cannot afford it, not its population size, not its economic size, and so forth. I think it's unfortunate that the conditions Turkey has imposed on Armenia and on Pashinyan, for example, to give up any mention of the Armenian genocide, to take off even an image of Mount Ararat, which is sort of the figure that represents Armenians for Armenia, but is located just on the Turkish side of the border, formerly Armenian lands of the eastern provinces, has forced it to even remove it from the entry stamp. When you entered Armenia, there would be sort of a outline of Mount Ararat and Mount Masis, and that has been removed as a concession. And basically, Pashinyan has been downplaying the Armenian genocide and demands for recognition of genocide by Turkey as a sort of concession to Turkish demands. I don't think that's a good basis for a relationship. That doesn't sound like a way to build a positive relationship going towards the future. It's one thing to say, okay, that's not going to be the center of our discussions, but to proactively demand that it be erased from Armenian consciousness in Armenia is certainly going to be problematic. I mean, mind you, Armenians and Turks already have relations and close ties, practically speaking. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians from Armenia work in Turkey. And unfortunately, Erdogan has often used that as a lever, as a threat of punishment, to say, I'm going to evict all the Armenians who are working here, whenever tensions flare and so forth. So that's unfortunate. But to the extent that the blockade of Armenia can be ended, to the extent that there can be the free flow of people and trade without conditions tied to, let's just, erase, pretend the genocide never happened, could work. But that condition, I don't think is an acceptable.
What do you think that this means for Putin's calculus? Where does it leave Russia as a power if it's an inability to influence election, even if you don't think it was? But, we've got a country that is drifting away from Moscow. I think that's pretty clear, at least politically. Culturally, of course, not as much. But what do you think this tells us about Putin's ability to project power?
I mean, it seems pretty clearly a consequence or a collateral damage of its war in Ukraine. I mean, the cost of the war in Ukraine to Russia has been felt in the Middle East. I mean, it basically gave up Syria so that it could focus its attention exclusively on Ukraine. It was not able to intermediate in any positive way in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And rather than sort of serving its traditional role of sending Russian forces and acting as a buffer, it did not, because it is completely taxed in Ukraine. And so I think that this is why it's such a sensitive matter for them to see Armenia so strongly sort of align itself with the US and the EU, so sort of in their face kind of thing. And I think that, is a sensitivity because they traditionally see the Caucasus as their zone of influence. In a moment when the US is expanding its zones of influence and asserting greater global zones of influence and talking about the world openly as zones of influence, Russia is seeing its zone of influence decrease. And, obviously it's not something Putin would choose, but it is the reality of a very costly and dominant war with Ukraine. And one would think that that would encourage Russia to find a resolution, but clearly that's not happening. And unfortunately, it seems that both Russia and Ukraine think that they could and will continue this war for gains, to the great, most tragic harm to the Ukrainian people.
Thanks for watching. That was a conversation with Leah Whitson, a human rights lawyer, founding executive director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, or DAWN, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, if you're someone who enjoys geopolitical conversations, coverage, coupled with economics and a better sense of how things work based on professional experience, then you're in the right place and should definitely subscribe for future conversations. Indeed, you should check out this video here to hear from Senator Mark Kelly about his recent trip to the Ukrainian Black Sea and the war with Russia. We'll see you on the next one. Don't forget to like the video.